Good afternoon, and welcome to today's panel discussion entitled The Pioneers and Abolitionism and Their Relevance Today. I have with me several panelists. Pastor Cody Francis, a pastor in the Northwest region of Michigan, a former educator at the collegiate level, and a district superintendent in Michigan. And Joi McClellan, an intern currently enrolled with the Center for Adventist Ministry to Public University Students, also known as Campus, equipped as a missionary on public campuses. She was recently accepted into school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, so congratulations to you, Joi. We also have with us guest historian and professor at Southern Adventist University, Kevin Burton, a graduate of Southwestern Adventist University. He taught English as a second language in the Czech Republic and Korea, and served as a chaplain at Ozark Adventist Academy. He's been published in various peer-reviewed journals and in the online resource Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists. He's also completing his dissertation regarding the Millerites and Adventist involvement with abolitionism. So welcome to you as well, Kevin. At this time, and before we start, I'd like to open up with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we invite your presence to be with us. We pray that you would lead us, guide us, and give us clarity of thought and wisdom as we discuss these very important topics. We thank you and we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Racial tensions are on the rise. In the past year, we've witnessed protests, marches, and other activities by various groups and entities over issues concerning race. Various movements and entities like Black Lives Matter, the debate over social justice, and systemic racism have emerged onto the national scene and are hotly contested, divisive, and partisan. These issues are also discussed within Adventist circles, on social media platforms, in various pulpits, and amongst church members. With such controversy, many Adventists are left not knowing what they should or could be doing or not. Should Adventists get involved when they witness injustice or prejudice taking place in society at large? And if so, what are some principled ways to get involved? Is it even our responsibility and role as Seventh-day Adventists, some may ask? Is there a historical precedent that we can glean from our past, namely from the Millerites, the early pioneers, and our early church history? Well, that's one of the reasons why we've invited Professor Kevin Burton, who's been studying this very thing. And so I want to take this time now to welcome Kevin. I'm thrilled to have you on. And he is at this time going to share his purview of the Millerites and Adventist involvement in the abolitionist movement. So at this time, welcome, Kevin, and you're free to share your presentation.
All right, I'll start with sharing my screen. And hopefully, does everybody see that there? I hope so. And we'll start presentation mode. Okay, so let's first off start by talking about abolitionism itself. A lot of people simply assume that people in the North were all abolitionists and people in the South were all pro-slavery. Neither of those is actually perfectly true. It's more true of the South than it is of the North. As it turns out, abolitionists were people who demanded, first and foremost, the immediate and total emancipation or abolition of slavery. And they also advocated for equal rights for Black Americans. Those are the two sort of things that historians look at and say are the defining aspects of abolitionism. It is true sometimes that abolitionists were able to live up to the first of these goals better than the second of them. They were not necessarily perfectly free from racism themselves, but nevertheless, they were mighty strides ahead of the overwhelming majority of America. In the early 1830s and late 1830s and 1840s, you really only have about 2% of Northern citizens that are abolitionists. There will be some growth throughout the 1840s and 1850s all the way up to the Civil War. But really the way that continues to spread is by weakening the movement, where they will drop the quests for both immediate and total abolition and equal rights. In 1848, you have the rise of the Free Soil Party, and their goal is to stop the extension of slavery, not to immediately abolish it or get equal rights for blacks. And then that will merge into the Republican Party, which is the one that people know to this day, in 1854 when that party is founded. And their goal is the same as the Free Soil Party, against the extension of slavery, and that's it. And so abolitionists are not equivalent to either the Free Soil Party or the Republican Party, although many abolitionists were in those parties. Nonetheless, they wanted to get at least as far as they could. But this is the abolitionist. And so if you want to know about them, they're looking for the immediate and total emancipation of slaves and equal rights for blacks, which includes blacks in the North as well as the South. There's a few varieties of abolitionists that you should know about. There are the Garrisonians, and these people are very much against denominations. They use the term sectarian back then, and that really basically just means denominations. And so Garrisonians were very critical of churches and clergy and this kind of thing, because they were very, the churches and the clergy tended to be the support. Oftentimes, far too oftentimes, they were the support of slavery in the South. And you have a lot of people who were against abolitionism in the church, just lots of them. Garrisonians also, after 1842, started to advocate for disunionism. And what's fascinating about this is abolitionists, Garrisonian abolitionists in the North, saying, we want the North to secede from the South so that it is absolved from slavery, so that the North can be free from that taint of slavery. And that really infuriated most people in the North and the South. They called it treason and all sorts of stuff. And we'll see that Adventists were, there were many Adventists who were disunionists and Garrisonians. They were also what we call Christian anarchists. Now, that needs to be understood too, because that does not mean that they were wanting chaos. That does not mean that they were wanting no order, or anything like that. What it literally means is this. This is the definition that works for this presentation that you need to understand for Christian anarchism. And that is simply this: God's law is above the laws of man. And so if there's ever a contradiction between the two, where the laws of man will contradict the laws of God, a Christian anarchist will always go with the laws of God. And so if you're asked to surrender a fugitive slave because the law says to, God's law says no, so you don't do it. You don't obey human law. Other aspects that are in with that include not participating in the political process, such as voting. And so Garrisonians, pure Garrisonians, they refuse to vote. They also refuse to observe things like national fasts and other things like that, because they believe that the government was corrupt because of upholding slavery. And so they wanted to not be a part of the government at all. Evangelical abolitionists are quite a bit different. They're not anti-sectarian. They're not against denominations. They're not against clergymen. They're going to be upset, about the fact of slavery in the churches and so forth. But they're going to persist in that they need to work in the churches to try to abolish these sins, rather than abandon the churches and come out of them and then work in a different avenue. And so most of them are not disunionists. They're not going to support come-outerism, which is coming out of these churches, declaring they're Babylon and leaving them. And so they have a different tactic. They're going to work in the churches to try to pass anti-slavery resolutions. They're also going to be involved in launching the free mission movement, to where you have missionary societies that are going to evangelize around the world but not support slaveholders. As you know, all the other missionary societies had slaveholders who were missionaries, and they would take their slaves with them across the world and so forth, and serve in the mission field. And so free mission societies were against that. They were only going to have free missionaries and so forth. And that was an abolitionist endeavor as well. You also had political abolitionists, and these are people who are not disunionists. They could be very much against the churches, though, and very much against the clergy. Often they were, but they formed the Liberty Party and a few other tiny parties who were definitely promoting abolitionism. The Liberty Party got two agendas. That's it. Number one, the immediate and total abolition of slavery, and number two, equal rights for blacks. Period. If you're okay with that, you're a Liberty Party man, and you're going to vote for those people to run for president or all the local offices and things like that. And that's it. They didn't have any other agenda. Nothing on the economy, nothing on any other aspects, nothing on foreign relations, none of that. Just immediate total abolition of slavery and equal rights for blacks. You have to also remember the fugitive slaves themselves. They are abolitionists in their own right, and they are going to play a major role by literally running on their feet, or getting shipped in a box, or taking a ride on a train under a fake name and fake identity. However they escaped. Some escaped on ships. The very fact that they're escaping is infuriating the South, and it will lead and take this nation to civil war. An even smaller number, especially earlier on, are the militant abolitionists, and they include people like Nat Turner, who is a slave and leads a slave rebellion in 1831, or the Amistad captives, who are illegally enslaved and brought to America and then eventually freed after lots of effort. And then also John Brown, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, all of these are important to mention, and I'm not going to cover all of them in this presentation, but all of these are important to mention because Millerites and Adventists fall into all of these categories, including fugitive slave abolitionists and including militant abolitionists. We have connections with the Amistad captives, not in the sense of violence, but we also have connections with John Brown, which does include violence. A Seventh-day Sabbath-keeping Adventist, not a Seventh-day Adventist per se. He is one of the Secret Six who will fund John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. And so every single one of these levels involves our early pioneers and our early heritage. You also have utopian abolitionists. These people are involved in utopian societies. They are communists in the sense that they are trying to reform land. They're rejecting the uses of money. They're rejecting the uses of, hierarchies in relation to male and female and work and so forth. So they're very much for equal rights for men and women. There are Millerites and so forth in this category. And then I'm adding apocalyptic abolitionism, and that is using apocalyptic tactics to advocate for the abolition of slavery and equal rights. And this, of course, is a category that gets all of the Millerites and Adventists because of their views of the second coming of Christ. So let's get into this. I want you to understand a little bit about the Jim Crow North so that you get the context here. So Richard Archer's book, Jim Crow North, it's a recent publication. Here's an important quote from him. He says this: "Blacks were denied political offices and suffrage. Schools often were not available. Well-paying employment was non-existent. Transportation was segregated or refused. Church attendees were separated so that even visiting African-American ministers had to sit in a distant black pew or in balconies. Travelers had to eat in kitchens rather than in dining rooms and sleep in garrets. That's just some room tucked in the back corner somewhere rather than in bedrooms like in a hotel. All that was abundant was humiliation and disdain. Compounding these troubles, the Colonization Society was attempting to send free blacks to Africa." And so this is a perspective of the North. This is what it is like across the northern states. It's a little bit better in New England, but you have Jim Crow segregation cars there. You have laws against interracial marriage there. But in some of the western states, you actually have it illegal for blacks to enter the state unless they have an official permission written by a white person. We don't need to go into all of the details about that here, but there are several other things I could mention. But the simple point is this. There was no appreciable equality for people who were of color in the North. And so they lived in an oppressed state. And an amazing quote from Frederick Douglass himself is that he insisted, and this comes from Douglass, I'm not going to defend it, I'm just going to repeat it to you. But Douglass insisted that free blacks in the North had it, in fact, worse than slaves themselves. You can argue with Douglass on that one if you want to, but that comes from him. So let's move on to some of the ways that Adventists are going to fight against systemic racism. And by that, I simply just mean that racism was everywhere in America. It was throughout the structures of government. It was out throughout the structures of society. And so when we say systemic, that means it's everywhere. And that's clear, both North and South. And so Adventists are going to use a variety of tactics to do this. They're going to use political tactics, whether or not that's in a political party like the Liberty Party, or through petitioning or something like that. And they will also use religious tactics. They will interpret scripture and so forth with liberation ideology, and they will be talking about freedom and rights for all people on the basis of the Bible. And so that's kind of what I mean by politics and religion. These things, these terms and categories, they really ebb and flow and go with each other and overlap so much that it's really easy to see how they are almost indistinguishable at times. But nevertheless, that's sort of the point. And we'll talk about the petitioning here. This is some fun stuff that I've uncovered in the National Archives and in state legislature archives as well. And let's go through some of these. So first of all, when it comes to petitioning, you have to understand that petitioning for abolitionism is very risky and unpopular. You've only got a few, like less than 10% for sure, people in the North who are abolitionists. Imagine signing your name to a petition. That's not a private act. A lot of people might assume that signing a petition is a private thing that no one else will know about. Like today, we can sign a petition online, and literally no one else is going to know that you did that unless you tell them. But in the 19th century, you're taking the pieces of paper, perhaps door to door, and in society, people who are approached to get their signature, they're going to see the other names on there if they want to. Or they might say, yeah, let me think about it. Let me see it, and then they would write their name if they wanted to or not. Another important thing is this. Newspapers got a hold of a lot of these petitions, and they could be quite visceral against abolitionists signing petitions. And they not only printed the petition, but oftentimes they print all the names of people who signed. And so that makes it very public. And so this is a very, very risky thing to do. You actually see abolitionist petitioners getting attacked a lot verbally and sometimes even physically, and so forth. But there's one really important thing about this. It's an important form of political protest. It's also a really good way to get to the ideology of a layperson. A lot of people in the 19th century in the Adventist movement, they were not prominent people. They wouldn't sit down and write out an article and say, boom, here's my views on slavery. I think it's horrible, a horrible sin, all this kind of stuff. They wouldn't do that. But they would sign a petition. And scholars recognize that petitions are multi-authorship documents. So there's a statement at the top of these things, and everyone who's signing their name there is saying virtually that it is as though I wrote that statement up there. I agree to it. It's as if I am the author of it, even though they didn't literally write the words. And so they give you a great insight into the political ideology of an average person in America. Okay, so there's a whole host of petitions that were circulating around the times. I'm going to give you a few of them as we get through this. Some of the first and least controversial dealt with trying to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia and petitioning against the annexation of new slave states and against the this one is not so. This one is pretty controversial. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. That's going to be revamped in 1850 into a very, very robust fugitive slave law. But this is important stuff. And one of the reasons that they're petitioning against slavery in the District of Columbia is because abolitionists mostly did not believe that Congress had the power or authority to abolish slavery in the states. They recognized states' rights. Okay. And so as a result, they weren't petitioning most of them were not petitioning for the immediate and total abolition of slavery. They didn't think that that was a realistic goal to be done via petitioning. And so they would do this for the District of Columbia because that's the nation's capital. And so they did recognize and believe that Congress had the ability to abolish slavery in its seat. And so that's what they're attempting to do in stuff like this. And obviously they think that Congress also has the ability to prevent the territories from allowing slavery, and then also from them being entered into the Union with a pro-slavery constitution. And so these were very common petitions among abolitionists. Well, here we have some signatures on one of these petitions. It's for the immediate abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, and it's against Florida and Texas being brought in to America as slave states. And take a look here at this petition. This is from the National Archives. I found it literally a needle in a haystack, and you've got the names of 2 Seventh-day Adventist ministers on this petition. They're next to each other, and that's because they know each other and they're friends. The first one is Harry G. Buck. Most of you probably don't know who that is, but he later moves. We're talking to Michigan Conference here. He later moves to Michigan, to Allegan County, and he becomes a leading Adventist minister there. And then John Byington. Hopefully you know who that is, because he became our first General Conference president. And so here's a petition from 2 of them, and then a host of others, of course, when they lived in New York before they moved to Michigan. And they're petitioning for the things I mentioned. You also have issues with congressional gag laws. And that is during the illustrious presidency of Andrew Jackson, who was, I'll just be quite blunt with you, one of the worst presidents of our history, most certainly one of the most racist presidents of our past. And I could go into a lot of detail there, but I'm not going to here. But one of the things that he does is during his presidency, there are gag laws instituted, which literally means that it is no longer possible for slavery to be debated in Congress. Okay? So they actually pass laws that inhibit and prohibit the freedom of speech. And so the subject of slavery is literally gagged. And so those laws are going to continue to be passed and repassed all the way from 1836 until 1844. And so this makes it really difficult to petition itself. And so abolitionists are petitioning for these gag laws, which are only preventing the discussion of slavery, the debate of slavery. They're petitioning for those to be totally abolished. And here is a petition submitted to the legislature of the state of Maine. And what was done is that they got signatures of women only. And in fact, women were the primary agents in petitioning. They far outstripped the men when it came to petitioning. And this, of course, is going to lead and be one of the important steps in developing the women's rights movement, which is going to really coalesce in 1848 in Seneca Falls. But these women are petitioning the legislature in Maine because they want Maine itself as a state to protest against the government, against these gag laws. And what's amazing here is that you see actually several Adventist signatures on this petition, but I'm showing you 2 here. And I've got stars by them. I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but one of them is Betsy White, and the other one is Elizabeth White. Betsy is James White's mother, and Elizabeth is James White's oldest sister. Those are the only 2 women in James White's family at this time who were old enough, that is 18 years or older, to sign this petition, and they both do. And James White later, he states in other places later that he was thoroughly raised in a thoroughly abolitionist home, and so forth. And so this, of course, is not surprising. There's other petitions here. So in the 1850s, you have the issue of Kansas and Nebraska. Before this time, the slavery debate had been settled to where slavery was not legal above the Mason-Dixon line, and then it was legal south of the Mason-Dixon line. Well, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to abolish that stipulation and say that new states who come into the Union have the right to determine this upon their own popular sovereignty. In other words, the people there get to decide whether or not the state is going to be pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And so this leads to Bleeding Kansas, where abolitionists from the North are going to move to Kansas and pro-slavery people from Missouri are going to move to Kansas, and they're literally going to fight each other, tooth and nail, guns, cannons, whatever, and slaughter one another because they're trying to get power in that state so that the state will go either pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And so this is really a significant hot button issue in America. Well, before it's passed in 1854, abolitionists are petitioning rapidly, against this. And so you see Seventh-day Adventists doing the same thing. This is Seventh-day Adventist minister Joseph B. Frisbee, who signs his petition when he's living not too far from Battle Creek, in that county at least, but not close enough to get other Adventists in Battle Creek to sign. And so you see a Seventh-day Adventist signing against that. One of my favorites is the Haitian independence petitions. Haiti was the only nation. It's the only nation in this earth that has successfully had a slave revolt lead to independence. And so at the late 18th century and early 19th century, Haiti won its independence. The slaves there won their independence from the French slave owners, and they declared themselves to be an independent nation. Well, the U.S. absolutely refuses to recognize Haitian independence until Abraham Lincoln is in office in 1862. And there's two main reasons for this. Number one, people are worried about sanctioning or giving legitimacy to slave revolts. Okay? That was really a hot button issue of deep concern to people in the South especially, but also numerous people in the North were very worried about slave revolts, not because of their own lives, but because they didn't want the nation to be rendered split apart. The other main reason that's driving this, though, is the belief that is current both in North and South, prevalent across the board, unless you're an abolitionist, that Black people are literally incapable, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally capable of self-governance. They literally did not believe that Black people had it within themselves to govern themselves. And so, if you recognize the independence of Haiti, a Black nation who won their independence from slavery, then you are saying, effectively, yes, they do have the ability and the right to govern themselves. And Americans absolutely refused to do that on this basis. They would not do it until the middle of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln is in office. But you have numerous Seventh-day Adventists, Millerites, who are petitioning for the independence of Haiti long before this, decades before this. Here is Stockbridge and Louisa Howland of Topsham, Maine, two of the most important Seventh-day Adventist pioneers. They are so important, in fact, so close to James and Ellen White, that they are basically the godparents. They would have never used that terminology, of course, but they were basically the godparents of the Whites' children. The Whites are traveling a lot, and Ellen too. They're preaching, they're spreading the message. They're going around from city to city, door to door, all this kind of stuff, and they can't take their kids with them, and so they leave their kids with the Howland family for years, and the Howlands basically raise their children. They're there for so many years, in fact, that they're actually listed on the census, which happens only every 10 years, living with Stockbridge and Louisa Howland. And so they are very important. There were several conferences, Sabbath conferences held at their house. The place was known, their home was known as Fort Howland in Adventist circles because of their prominence here. And they were staunch abolitionists, and they were advocating for the independence of Haiti. And believe me, when we're talking about the radicalness of these abolitionist petitions, this petition here is way more radical than trying to get the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia or abolishing gag laws, for example. Far fewer abolitionists would be willing to sign a petition like this. Here's a Seventh-day Adventist minister, Ezra A. Poole, also signing this petition. And he was a staunch abolitionist, and before his Adventist years, he was one of the members of the Lane Rebels, which is a very important part about abolitionist history that I'm going to just gloss. Sorry, but for the sake of time, we're going to move on. You have a lot of petitions against the Jim Crow North. Here is Seventh-day Adventist Mary Nichols, who is petitioning for the abolition of all laws in Massachusetts that make a distinction on the basis of color. And she is the wife of Otis Nichols. He's the man who makes the first prophecy chart for Seventh-day Adventists. very important, very close with the whites and all other Adventist leaders. She's doing this. This petition is geared towards a lot of things, but specifically it's geared towards the laws that say black people and white people and Native Americans cannot intermarry. And so what happens, these petitions cause an outrage in the North, absolute outrage in the North, as well as the South. But they are so upset that you're going to start to see lots of pictures and so forth and images of women dancing with black men and so forth, etc. And the propaganda that spawned from this is throughout the North is that all of these women, because it was only women who signed these petitions, and so they start to say that all of these white women are wanting to sign these petitions because they want to have sex with black men. And so that is a propaganda campaign that starts when these petitions are first put out in 1839. And abolitionist men will start joining the fight after this. But here's an example of the image I was just talking about, where you see all of these white women dancing with these men. It's called an amalgamation waltz. An amalgamation was a total sexual term where people are worried about white and black people being together. And then, of course, as they become closer and closer in their friendship, that will lead to romantic relationships, which will lead to babies, etc. And so you can see how racist this is because the features of the black men are exaggerated, where they almost look baboonic or ape-like. That's a very racist tactic in the 19th century and even 20th century. And you'll still see some rare cases of this today. And so this is a response. Images like this are responses to these petitions. Well, other men get involved, including Joseph Bates, one of the founders of our church. And he will not just sign these, but Joseph Bates himself will circulate these petitions. And he will petition for the abolition of these interracial marriage laws so that black and white people could intermarry if they wished. You see Joseph Bates here. His name is at the very top of this petition that he circulates in 1842. This is well into his Millerite Adventist experience. William Gifford is another Seventh-day Adventist pioneer there. He's also an Underground Railroad operator in his earlier life. And then Prudence Bates is Joseph Bates's wife, and she signs these petitions as well. So this is crucial. And one of my favorites, we'll end with this one on the petitioning. This is a petition from 1862. And this is one that actually includes the name of our denomination. This petition, as you can see on this, this is from the National Archives. It's addressed to the President of the United States, it's Abraham Lincoln, and to Congress. And so this is April 1862, so it's into the Civil War, about a year into the Civil War, basically a year exactly. And it says, the undersigned Seventh-day Adventists and others, citizens of Lynn County in the state of Iowa. And so the petition here is signed by over 40 people, almost all of whom are Seventh-day Adventists. And so that's an amazing thing to see them use the name of our church. And in this petition, they're arguing that slavery should be totally abolished. They're not quibbling over about whether Congress has the authority to do this. They say it should be done because it's a sin and a crime against the nation and against God. It's against God's eternal laws. And so they throw in religious arguments into this. And they argue that the current Civil War is but the retributions of the wrath of God because of the sin of slavery, which you can see and hear some echoes of Ellen White in the petition itself, I believe. So this is a petition that we found earlier, about a year ago at the National Archives, just before COVID shut the National Archives down. So I'm very glad that we found this before COVID happened. Let's talk about religion. Let's talk about some of the religious tactics of abolitionism. And the Underground Railroad is an important facet because it's both political, it's both religious. It's really difficult to say this is just a political issue or this is a religious issue because you can't separate them. And I say here on this slide that I know of over 20 Millerites and Adventist Underground Railroad operators. Well, when I made this presentation first many months ago, that was the case. But I now know of numerous more than this. It was actually quite a common phenomenon, especially during the Millerite period when we had a lot more people that we could look for. And the Underground Railroad was a vast network of people working together. And so to be part of the Underground Railroad does not mean you're always doing the most daring, the most dangerous stuff, although there were Adventists who did those things. But it could include people who are funding it. because in fact, there were agents who were paid for their work on the Underground Railroad, which most people don't understand or realize. And so you see lots of Adventists actually funding the Underground Railroad by sending money to vigilance committees and so forth. But then you also see them serving on these committees and then actually doing some of the most dangerous and daring things. The two most important that are in our heritage are Garrett Smith, here pictured. He lived in Peterborough, New York. He was a Millerite, a very important Millerite. He also adopts the Seventh-day Sabbath in the late 1840s, and he knows numerous Seventh-day Adventists personally. In fact, one of the people he will purchase their liberty from Louisiana. His name is John West, and he will purchase his freedom and bring him to Peterborough, and he will give him a home and place to live and a job there in Peterborough. And John West will convert to Seventh-day Adventism within about a year or less of being there. And he becomes one of the first Black Seventh-day Adventist ministers because Garrett Smith allows him to hold Sabbath services every Sabbath afternoon in the free church there in Peterborough. And so John West is holding services every Sabbath there for Adventists that live in that area. And interestingly enough, all of the people in his church that we know of, at least, were white. So Garrett Smith is heavily involved in the Underground Railroad. He is the one who will be one of the Secret Six and fund John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. And unfortunately, after that period, he goes insane, and he actually gives up the Seventh-day Sabbath and the Advent doctrine in the wake of his insanity. But nevertheless, before that, he is one of the most important abolitionists across the board. He would have been a multi-billionaire by today's standards, and he bankrolls much of the movement. Next to him is William Still. And William Still you can see he's African-American. He lived in Philadelphia. He is known as the father of the Underground Railroad, and he is one of the most important figures because he kept meticulous records of almost everyone he assists and to escape on the Underground Railroad. And he helps famous people like Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman rolls through his office, and he assists her, and then he will continue to assist her along with the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee as she goes back numerous times to the South to free people in her family and other people that she knows there in Maryland. And he joins the Millerite movement in the 1840s, and he never gives it up. He remains an Adventist his entire life, although he never kept the Seventh-day Sabbath. But nevertheless, he retains his affiliation with Adventists and donates money to the cause and so forth all the way through the years of his life. And so those are really important people. Well, there's religious backing to this. So you may not be familiar with this passage in Deuteronomy 23, 15, and 16, but it's really fascinating. This is what it says. I think I quote the King James Version here because that's a very common version in the 19th century. And it says this: "Thou shalt not deliver to his master the servant," or slave, you could say, "which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him." Well, Millerites and Seventh-day Adventists across the board, they said, this is God's fugitive slave law. And so when the federal government passes laws that say that you are required to actually assist in the recapture of slaves, and if you do not assist them in this, you're going to be fined at least $3,000 and spend up to 6 months in jail, Adventists, including Ellen White, will say, you are duty-bound to disobey that. This is a classic example of Christian anarchism. This is an example where human laws contradict the laws of God, and Adventists are absolutely duty-bound to follow Scripture and God's laws and refuse to follow the laws of man in this instance. And so they are willing to break federal law and risk the consequences. And this is serious. $3,000 doesn't sound like much, but that's actually several years' wages for the average working person. And losing 6 months in jail of work, you're literally going to bankrupt and cripple your family if you're an average farmer, which most Adventists were. So this is no joke. Very risky, which is why it was a very clandestine thing, and finding records and so forth is actually quite challenging. But here's a statement from Ellen White herself, and she's not alone. Adventists were saying this from 1850 on, and Ellen White comes out very clearly with the authority of God himself in vision and says this: I was shown that we have men placed over us for rulers and laws to govern the people. Were it not for these laws, the world would be in a worse condition than it is now. Some of these laws are good and some are bad. So she's upholding law here. She's not like chaos here, but this is still significant what she's saying here. The bad, however, the bad laws have been increasing, and we are not yet brought into straight, and we are yet to be brought into straight places. But God will sustain his people in being firm and living up to the principles of his word. Where the laws of men conflict with God's word and law, we are to obey the word and law of God, whatever the consequences may be. Whether that's death, which people in the Underground Railroad did die, imprisonment, lots of people are imprisoned, fines, whatever it may be, you will follow the law of God. The laws of our land requiring us to deliver a slave to his master, we are not to obey, and we must abide the consequences of the violation of this law. A direct response from Ellen White in response to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Fascinating stuff here. She continues to go on a few more eloquent things. It is perhaps known to many of you, and Brian Strayer in his biography of John Byington provided more evidence for us of our first General Conference president, John Byington, who operated a stop on the Underground Railroad at his home in Bucksbridge, New York. And so you see a picture of him here and a painting of Bucksbridge of the two churches that he built. The one on the left that's small, that's the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The one on the right is Wesleyan Methodist, which he was a member of before joining the Seventh-day Adventists. And the Wesleyan Methodists, as well as us as Adventists, were an abolitionist church. And here you see pictures of some of the hiding places that John Byington built into some other churches that he built, as well as into some of the places that ministers resided in. And so he was active in this part. And there are many others too, but I'm going to leave it at that point. Now, I think I'm running out of time, but I will share with you in brief how we work in abolitionism to our three angels' messages, to our fundamental beliefs. So in a nutshell, what does that first angel say? Revelation 14, 6 and 7. We should be familiar with these texts. Fear God and give him glory for what? The hour of his judgment is come. Question. If judgment is coming, who is being judged? And what is the distinguishing factor? In other words, you have to define what sin is and who sinners are so that you know who is going to be judged. And so Seventh-day Adventists, following from William Miller on, William Miller was a staunch abolitionist himself, they make it quite clear. Who is judgment coming upon? Slave owners. And in fact, William Miller, and Ellen White will echo this later, he argues that the 7 last plagues of Revelation 16 are going to be poured out upon slaveholders in America and pro-slavery Americans, just like the 10 plagues had been poured out on slaveholding Egypt. And so this is crucial. So whenever they're talking about the first angel's message in this hour, the hour of judgment, they're emphasizing in their sermons and in their preaching and in their writing, they're emphasizing, beware. If you support slavery, beware because you will be damned. The second angel says that Babylon is fallen, and we tie this in, and Adventists have always tied this in with Revelation 18:4, which has another angel saying, come out of her, come out of Babylon, my people, so that you are not partakers of her sins and you receive not her plagues. Well, later on in chapter 18, some of those sins are listed, and they're all economic, or they're dealing with, and they're tied in with slavery. Because one of the things that Babylon does is engage in merchandise of gold and silver and several other things, and the end of the list says, and slaves in the souls of men. And Adventists were confident that this was a text in the Bible that absolutely condemned slavery, bar none, no questions asked. It's clear. People who support slavery, they are supporting Babylon. And so therefore, if you are doing this, if you're part of the churches who are doing this, the Protestant churches doing this, then you are duty-bound as an Adventist to come out of Babylon. And this is the beginning of our movement. because we come out of these churches and we've only portrayed it in our history as coming out because they rejected the Advent doctrine. That is categorically untrue. It was both that and probably more importantly, I believe more importantly even, because they supported slavery. Here's a sermon from Charles Fitch, one of the most important sermons that he preaches on this subject in the summer of 1843 that's very pivotal for Seventh-day Adventists. It's called Come Out of Her, My People. And he says this. He's asking the question, how can we prove to people that Protestantism is Babylon? He actually says in his sermon, everybody knows that the Catholic Church is Babylon, but how can we show that Protestantism is Babylon too? What is his proof? It's not rejection of the Advent doctrine. He says this, how is she occupied? Is she not engaged for her own aggrandizement in every species of merchandise ascribed to Babylon, even to slaves in the souls of men? The spirit of oppression reigns in greater or less proportions of the leading sex, unrebuked, and a man may sell or buy his fellow man and then sit at the communion table or even minister at the altar of God and pass by the mass of Protestant Christendom, go unreproved. Charles Fitch says this is proof that Protestants are Babylon, that the Protestant majority is Babylon. And it is true. The Protestant majority, all of the major Protestant churches in America absolutely refused to call slavery a sin until the middle of the Civil War. That's a big deal. People in the North were not abolitionists. Most of them were not. And the dividing line when it came to religion was, would you admit that slavery is actually a sin? Because if you do, then that does mean that you're going to be damned in the judgment, which could come for Adventists. They're insisting that's going to come in just a few years. For all other Christians, they believe that came at your death. If you died and you don't know when that hour is, if you haven't confessed all of these sins, you're damned. And so you're doomed. And so Adventists made this quite clear. Jane Andrews continues this. During the antebellum period in the 1850s, when the Seventh-day Adventist Church is there, even though we haven't adopted the name officially, Jane Andrews says this in the review. He says, the Protestant Church at the present time holds many 100,000 slaves, nor is the fact to be disguised that the professed church is now the right arm of the slave power. Let this sink in here. This great fact identifies the Protestant church as a part of Babylon with absolute certainty. What's his text? Boom, right there. Revelation 18:13, where it says that Babylon engages in selling the slaves and souls of men. And so for Adventist pioneers, it was clear throughout that Protestant churches are part of Babylon because of slavery. Yes, they also reject the Advent doctrine, and that led to the rise of us as a denomination. But a huge factor is that they are supporting slavery. Imagine this. Adventists are trying to gather new members throughout the 1850s. How convincing is it going to be to go around and say, look, all these churches are Babylon because they rejected our doctrine that we think is super important, the Advent doctrine. A lot of people would just laugh at that. But when you get on their ground and you say, no, slavery is a sin, and the Protestant churches are supporting that, then you have a wedge to enter in and make success. And that's, of course, how they did it. And, of course, the only way they're going to do that is if they are appealing to a class of people in the North who are willing to admit, yes, slavery is a sin. And I am tired of seeing that in my church. And so, yes, my mind is now open to looking into other aspects of truth. And so this became a powerful way for Adventists to win new converts. Ellen White is quite clear that this is not just a matter of leaving the Protestant churches, leaving Babylon because of supporting slavery, but you must stay out. And so as you march through the 1850s, pro-slavery sentiment spikes in the North, especially right before the Civil War. People in the North are really concerned about the forthcoming war. They don't want it, and so they are willing to bend over backwards and give all concessions to slave owners in the South to prevent war, to prevent the nation from splitting. And that impacts a few Seventh-day Adventists as well. And Ellen White makes it categorically clear. She says, if that is the case, Adventists supporting slavery must be disfellowshipped. And so I have the quote here. I'm going to just gloss it for the sake of time. I'm basically out of time. I'm going to mention one last thing here, and that's the third angel's message, and then we'll wrap it up and discuss this, okay? After the first and second angels come, the third angel comes, and the third angel's message is the most pivotal for Seventh-day Adventists because we recognize that William Miller was heralding the first angel's message. The second angel's message was when Charles Fitch and others said to come out of Babylon. And then the third angel is about the Sabbath and connected with Seventh-day Adventism in particular, as we interpret it. And so this is crucial. Revelation 14, 9 through 12 is about this third angel, but it says this here in this text: do not worship the beast and his image and receive the mark on his forehead or on his hand. That's part of the three angels' message. Question: who is the beast and who is his image? You cannot understand this passage unless you understand the one that came just before that in Revelation 13, 11 through 17. And it's about the two-horned beast that rises out of the earth, that makes an image to the first beast. Okay? And Adventists interpret this beast to be the United States of America. And so they start to present this, they start to add it to their prophecy charts. And so you see here that here's a great image that encapsulates this. How are you going to prove that America, your nation, your beloved nation, is a beast in Scripture? And they're not saying it's going to become a beast. You know, like when a national Sunday law is passed, for example. They're saying, no, it's a beast now, right now. Why is it a beast now? Well, it's a beast because of violations of both religious liberty laws and racial injustice. And so they tie condemnation of blue and black laws together. So it was about racial justice as well as religious liberty. It was not simply about religious liberty, and it was not just about Sunday laws or blue laws. In fact, those are far inferior in their argumentation compared to laws about blacks and slavery and so forth. Here's Jan Loughborough on this from 1853, an early article by him. It's titled The Image of the Beast, and he writes this: this government allows men to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience, but they bind men's consciences on other subjects. Why not on Sunday observance? So we're talking about blue laws. The government of the United States requires us to deliver up to his master the slave that has escaped from him, whether we believe God on this point or not, and a heavy fine if we do not. And now he's talking about black laws. He combines both of those to say that this is the beast. And he continues, God says, thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant that has escaped unto thee. Deuteronomy 23:15. I suppose, however, the objector is not aware what is going on around us in the United States. And now he's going to launch into blue laws. Pennsylvania, for example, has strict blue laws, he says. I'm just going to sum this up. And he says that there are even some people who are arrested for breaking Sunday. So these things, last line here, suffice it to say, we doubt not the image makers will complete their image. Why is America the beast? It's the beast because of these things. See, it has two horns. Adventists believe that one horn represented civil liberty, the other horn represented religious liberty. And it looked like a lamb because those are good things, right? Civil and religious liberty are good. However, it is actually a dragon, and it speaks like a dragon because it actually denies religious liberty to religious minorities, and it denies civil liberty to racial minorities. That is why you see the image here on your screen. America symbolized as this beast, and you have slavery and creed specifically mentioned there. You have trains there, telegraph lines there, fire coming down, lightning coming down from heaven. All of this is just symbolic to say that America is this beast. These are the reasons why. And so Adventists preach this everywhere they go. They put this on their prophecy charts. You have both men and women, both the clergy and lay people, preaching this in churches. They're going to talk about it in lyceums and reading groups and societies in their local towns and communities. And this is a major part of Seventh-day Adventism. And I call this doctrine a fundamental belief of the Adventist church because they put it on the prophecy chart. You could not understand the three angels' message, the third angel's message in particular, without understanding this doctrine. And so this is crucial. And unfortunately, this is going to all change. Unfortunately, Adventists will reject key aspects of that doctrine. They will stop referring to America as currently the beast. They will start to say this is just a future thing. At some point, America is going to adopt a national Sunday law, and at that point, it's going to become the beast. But right now, it's not the beast yet. And so whenever we start to make those kinds of argumentations, and that starts to become really popular in the wake of World War I, some major things have changed, which is why people look at this and they hear this and they're like, calling that a fundamental belief, that doesn't sound right. Why haven't we heard it? You haven't heard it because Adventists ended up trying to reject it in subtle ways, and they did. But that's another story. We can get into it in the discussion. How about we call it done for now? I think I'm a little bit over time.
Yeah, no, and I could certainly even listen to you longer, but and you kind of touched upon this as far as at the very end, and so I just want to thank you for that presentation. Very informative. I want to also invite the listeners that you can find more other presentations and longer presentations that Kevin has covered with Ivan Myers and also Light Bearers and some other entities. But I want to transition to a question and kind of relate to what we've seen back then to today's context. And that is, Millerites and early Adventists were clearly involved in anti-slavery initiatives against the slave-owning South and the North, where racism and segregation were pervasive, as you outlined there. They were speaking out against explicit pro-slavery laws of the land. Now, we don't see similar societal engagement by Adventists today. And so the question I have is that because there's no equivalent explicit racist laws, or have we as a people changed? Has our mindset shifted over the years? And I'd like to listen to your perspective on that.
Sure. I think it's, to be fair, change has happened across the board. So America has changed. Adventists have changed. And that shouldn't shock anyone or surprise anybody. As humans, we just simply change. It's impossible to be just like people were before us. It just isn't possible. We're different, okay? And God accepts that. But yes, I do think that as a big picture here, I think that Adventists simply dropped the ball on this issue. Here's why. Most people assume that slavery was just an obvious injustice. It was so clear. So that's no wonder that Adventists would participate in the abolition movement. That's absolutely untrue, in fact. And see, the thing is that it was actually unclear to almost everybody. And that's the absolute point. When I'm saying that most Christians in the North are refusing to call slavery a sin until the Civil War, that is indicative of the fact that it was unclear to them. They weren't willing to make that call because they weren't sure that slave owning was actually wrong. And think about this. I mean, slavery had been around for thousands of years. Now, it had changed, and since the 1470s, it was race-based, and it was also chattel slavery, and so there's differences, but most people weren't aware of that or didn't think about that. They were unaware of the fact that most slaves before that were actually white, and so these things were unclear to them, but nevertheless, it was not a clear issue. It's the same today. There are really important laws on the books that that are unjust for people of color. You can talk about things like mass incarceration, and how there are laws in place that allow people to racially profile. People have this stereotype in their mind that a black man is more likely to commit crime than a white person. That's actually untrue. But what is true is that they are imprisoned more frequently or proportionally than white people. But that's not because they engage in more crime. It's because they are sought out more by law officers. And there's study after study after study. So all of these kinds of things, they require us to be engaged in issues of the day. We have to do research. We have to be familiar with issues and so forth so that we can see where the injustice actually lies. And that's the crucial thing that makes the doctrine of the two-horned beast super relevant and super powerful for us today. Adventists recognized that injustice is always masked with justice. That beast looks like a lamb, but it's actually a dragon. How do you know that? How do you prove it? You have to unmask. You have to expose the dragon. You have to expose the injustice so that people can see it. And then you can move forward. But if you can't do that, if you just look at America as this perfect little lamb, it's got everything right. there's no national Sunday law, so we're golden, right? Then you're missing important aspects that our pioneers, I think, understood. That America looks like a just nation. It looks like a good, cute little lamb.
Are there, this is a quick follow-up question, are there any historical incidents or things that happened or events that happened that took us on a trajectory that maybe took us off course from what our earlier history presented?
Yeah, there's several things. It's very complicated, and we do need a thorough study of this now that I'm finding out that we really had a very strong abolitionist background. We need to answer this question in really good detail. But in short answer, America changes. So after slavery is abolished, Reconstruction is going to happen, and there are going to be federal troops in the South to ensure that Black people can vote and can be elected. And many Black people, not a ton, but several Black people are elected to offices in the South. And that's because there are federal troops there from the North allowing that and making sure that can happen. In 1877, that's taken away. Reconstruction ends. Federal troops are withdrawn, and you have the rise of what we call Jim Crow, which is Jim Crow segregation in the South, similar to what it was like in the North before. But now you're going to have all of these rigid laws passed for all kinds of injustices to run rampant. Well, as that's happening, guess what Adventists are doing? We're starting to truck down south. And so during this period of time, we start to evangelize in the South in more detail. And as we do so, Adventists start in the South to uphold the color line. And so the first Adventist missionaries that go down there to help the freed people in Texas, Joseph and Sarah Clark, you can read my article about this on the Adventist Encyclopedia. They absolutely refuse to segregate, and they are their lives are threatened. The mission there is threatened, and they literally left to go down there as Reconstruction ended. Literally within days of Reconstruction ending, they go down there to teach freed people because they recognize that injustice is going to be a huge problem. The KKK is running all over Texas. It's very dangerous. And so they only survived there 16 months. Adventist leaders were in conflict. Robert Kilgore doesn't approve of their method. He wants to segregate. And you have Black people themselves, the freed people themselves, that are saying, please, for our safety, let's not do this. Let's not push this issue. It's too dangerous right now. And so the Clarks refuse, as Joseph says, to, quote, bow down to the great goddess caste. And so they end up leaving and abandoning that mission. And in the wake of that, Adventists start to segregate churches in the South. Eventually, that will creep north. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the General Conference will move in early 19th century, early 20th century to Washington, D.C. The General Conference President A.G. Daniels is not going to. He doesn't approve of the fact that we have an interracial church there in D.C. He wants to set the church there in D.C. as the example for the church to follow. And so he asks them he basically says to deintegrate. And so some of them refuse and they hold on to their interracial church. And then you now have a white church and a Black church and then an interracial church. 3 churches now in D.C. And it causes a host of issues. The interracial church will end up leaving for a while. There's lots of conflict over this issue that gets caused. Another major aspect, though, is it's not just America changing. It's not just Adventists changing and accommodating and sort of bowing down to the great goddess caste, as you might say. But also the government plays a role in this as well. And that's because during World War I, they are very upset with our doctrine of the two-horned beast. They consider it to be un-American, unpatriotic, and they heavily surveil our church. Within the first 6 months alone of World War I, the FBI received over 10,000 complaints against us. And they had to investigate everything. That was their policy. And so they surveilled us heavily. Our churches, our publishing houses, all of these things. And one of the key things that they didn't like is the doctrine of the two-horned beast. And they tell our leaders, either you go to prison for a long time or you change this. And so in one of the most popular books of the time, it's called Bible Readings for the Home Circle. One is probably our very most popular call-porting book, sold well over 1 million copies by that point. And in the middle of World War I, they changed that doctrine, and this is what they do. Before they had been saying what Adventist said before: America is the beast now, and it's a beast because of the issues of the two horns, denying civil and religious liberty to minorities. But they dropped the civil horn. They focus on a national Sunday law, and because the national Sunday law doesn't currently exist, they say America will become in the future this beast. And so America is not the beast now. And they also do one further thing, and that is say that it's not really the federal government, but the liberals in America are going to take over the government with a coup. And at that point, then they will enact a national Sunday law, and America will become the beast. And so those are changes that are subtle, yet very important. And as a result of that, we lost our most important doctrine that we've been using to speak out on social justice, on justice, injustice, speak out against injustice to people of color. And so we no longer had this thing that had been so central before. And so it's a complex thing. And even the federal government plays a role in this process. And our leaders at the time were willing to make those changes to accommodate the state.
I believe Joi has something to ask.
I had a few questions, but I'm thinking here, you started to talk a little bit about the development of the color line when basically the church wasn't able to move forward in the South just because of the Jim Crow laws and all the segregation. And the whole thing with Daniels, and I think the preacher was Louis Sheath.
Yes,
started those churches in Washington D.C. And if I remember correctly, they saw that it was going well. Like the world on the outside was looking at it, and it was like, wow, this church can actually work, in a unsegregated, way. And so we still push for, split between, black church, white church. And I just thought it was very interesting to note that our witness to the world changed. In fact, one of the members of that church wrote, like, it was hardening people's hearts away from the gospel by the way that they saw that we were succumbing to the societal norms. And I'm just thinking, my question is for today, how can the way that we as Adventists engage in this conversation and approach these issues either enhance or detract from our gospel influence?
Yeah, that's an important question, because if you take a stand on this, then you could potentially limit people who might come in. Well, I think that we need to. I think that God has called us to take a stand, and I think we need to be bold. And I think that's the most important thing, and be unashamed of the gospel. And the gospel includes justice and equality for all people. We are all journeying to the same heaven, as Ellen White says. And this was a crucial factor for Millerites in the 1840s. The reason that they were involved in this is because they wanted to enact and live heaven on earth as a witness to people, so that they would know what to expect, and also so that they would be without excuse. If they didn't want that, if they didn't want an equality, a racially equal heaven, which most didn't, if they didn't want that, then they would have no excuse when the judgment came. And so those are the reasons driving them forward. And that's powerful. I don't know why we should ever give that up. It's such a beautiful concept, because that's true. That's what heaven is. Heaven is, there's no color line in heaven. Ellen White makes that very clear. But even the Bible makes that very clear, right? So this is not, we don't have to go to Ellen White, but she's very strong on this. So I think that we have to be willing to take a stand. But that doesn't mean we need to be annoying, loud, or rude, or damning. We need to be loving and try to love people and even when it comes to people who are against us, we've got to find ways to love those people and hold our principles while still trying to reach them, even at the most bare minimum level, if that's all we can do. To be on a practical level, let me just say this, though. Let me add to this, because look, guys, in America, white people are not coming into the church. Let's face it. Okay. So if we start to uphold racial justice now, there's only one thing that's going to do for the church now, and that's benefit and boost the church, because the people that are adding to our church in America, by and large, are people of color. Okay. And so that it shouldn't, not that we don't want to, of course we don't want to stop, evangelizing to white people, and it shouldn't be about that. I mean, this message should not be divisive like that. But nevertheless, if somebody is concerned in that regard, think about where our converts are already coming from, and so forth. And so don't be ashamed or alarmed. But also, I think we need to have dialogue, and we need to continue to talk about this. This is not an issue where anyone should feel uncomfortable. We should be at a place where we can feel comfortable to talk about this issue. It's just another issue. It really is. It's another issue. So yes, injustices are being done and have been done for centuries and millennia to certain groups of people. It's another issue, and it's a horrible issue, and it needs to be addressed and dealt with now. But I'm talking to white people now, like myself. Don't be embarrassed. Accept the fact that white people have simply made so many mistakes in the past, still do in the present, and let's fix it. Let's move on. It doesn't mean that you are inherently incapable as a white person of being able to do better or make positive change, but you have to accept we cannot live in an era, the era that is over, well, at least officially over, of Executive Order 13950. Okay, if you are familiar with Executive Order 13950, that is an order passed by the previous president saying that racism is bad, and we can't have racism. And what he means, without saying it, and I could unpack this for you if we had more time, is that we shouldn't be racist against white people. And so in that executive order, they abolished all race training, diversity training, and so forth for public workers, for people who worked for the government, et cetera, because it was considered by the president to be un-American to talk about things like slavery and the atrocities that white people had done to black people. That's not un-American to talk about. That's just what America was. And we need to own that up. We cannot live in that world of denial and say that it's racist against white people to talk about the sins of white people in the past. I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept that at all. And we have to move beyond that. And that shouldn't embarrass anybody. I mean, come on, I was born in the South. All of my ancestors were in the Confederacy. Okay. All of them. I know some of them at least owned slaves. Most of them were too poor to. It doesn't matter. Like, we're guilty. That blood is on my hands, at least in the sense of like ancestry and all of that. But like, it doesn't matter. I'm not beholden and bound to that, and I can reject that past, that part of my ancestors and still, appreciate the fact that I exist because of them. But I'm not going to do what the United Daughters of the Confederacy do and try to memorialize it, because that that continues the injustice and prolongs injustice in America. And also, Ellen White and our pioneers were quite clear that the devil himself was inspiring the Confederacy. So I'm not about to create a monument or hold up a flag that was inspired by the devil himself at one point. So you can guarantee I'm not about to do that. So anyhow, I'm talking a lot. Hopefully that gives some answer. There's a lot more that should be said on that point. There's a lot more that we need to talk about. Dialogue, conferences, let's move forward. Let's take action, not just talk, and so, but let's move forward. Let's not be afraid. Let's be bold. This is God's message. He died for all of us. So if we're having troubles loving all equally because of an issue of race, that is a barrier to heaven.
Yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned the different types of abolitionism during the American history, basically, and you said that Adventists were part of all of those different types. Mm-hmm. I'm particularly interested. I mean, you mentioned militant abolitionism, John Brown probably being the case in point, although you gave some other examples as well. And I'm wondering how Adventists dealt with that then, because here was something that was violent that would, you assume that they would oppose violence, but yet he's doing it for a cause that they were supportive of. And so I'm wondering how they navigated those issues. And I'm asking because we have issues today where some of the protest for equality and justice can become violent. We don't support violence. So how did they navigate that? How do we navigate it today? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this is a very great question. Very relevant. Yeah, so most Adventists were supportive of peace, but one of the ways that they did participate violently is a lot of Adventists actually did join the Union Army and fight against the Confederacy. But on John Brown specifically, we have some really good insights because Adventists, they really liked John Brown. They loved John Brown, to be quite frank with you. In fact, it's so much so that like even after he's assassinated, like Jan Loughborough literally crosses America searching for his widow so that he can meet with her and talk with her. Like that's how much they love John Brown. Okay, so but during his raid and after his raid, northern newspapers and especially southern newspapers, but northern newspapers all come out ridiculing this guy. He's a fool for thinking that this would ever work. It's ridiculous nonsense, all this kind of stuff. And Jan Loughborough tells a story about how he and James and Ellen, and there was another Adventist minister with them, I believe. They were in Michigan at the time when this happened, and they're reading the newspapers. And Loughborough and James White and so forth, they look at this and they laugh in disbelief because they're like, how could this guy think this would ever work? They're just kind of buying into the propaganda of the press, really. And Ellen White, according to Loughborough, Ellen White censured them right there on the spot. And she told them not to laugh. And while she did not condone the violence, she says that he was right in his cause because he was trying to right an injustice. And she says that he was right. And that's an amazing thing because Ellen White never was trying to condone the violence. She's not for that. She doesn't want people to die. But nevertheless, she's willing to say, in spite of that fact, he was advocating for something that was good that God blessed and ordained. And that's a powerful thing that really makes us wrestle with this. But there's more to that. Like you can see here, that inspires Adventists because shortly after he dies, James Redpath, an abolitionist, publishes a very hagiographical biography of John Brown that's just making him into this martyr, glorious figure and all this kind of stuff. And Uriah Smith in the review advertises and says, they need agents to sell this book in Michigan. So who can do it? Basically. So Adventists were close to this. And they did not, you don't see anything negative about John Brown in the Adventist review. Nothing. It's only positive. And so, and like I say, Jan Loughborough traipsing across California, got to find his widow, got to talk with her, got to know more about this, and so forth. So they had a respect for him. And that's a respect that only abolitionists appreciated. And so that's another really good indicator of their strong abolitionist connections. And hopefully that can speak to us today. So if we see a protest that gets violent on the issue of race, it's very easy for us to laugh or just be appalled because of the violence. And I'm appalled by the violence. I'm not going to deny it. I'm not supportive of violence. I'm a pacifist. But at the same time, I recognize that they are fighting against a real injustice and they're tired. The reason that it's becoming violent is because people have been speaking out for so long and things aren't changing. And especially during the last 4 years of our nation's history, things appeared so dark and so depressing on these issues. How could we ever move forward? And so it is not surprising that these things have occurred. And while I personally do not condone the violence and I reject it, I would never participate in those kinds of acts myself, I can still look at them and say what they're advocating for, at least at a basic level. We can debate issues too in there, but at least at a basic level, there is a real truth to what they're fighting for. And that should be respected and we should support it. It doesn't mean we have to support it in that manner. I think we should not support it in that manner. But we need to find a way that we are comfortable supporting it and move forward in that way. Here's the thing. There's a variety of ways that we can approach these issues. And so find a way that works for you, that's in harmony with our beliefs, upholding the sanctities of life, etc. And that's how we can move forward. We don't have to move forward by compromising some sort of ideology. But unfortunately, we live in an era where many people, including Adventists, are going to be upset if we talk about Black Lives Matter, because they're going to associate it with communism or something like that and think, oh, that's horrible. We're going to bring in all sorts of other injustices if we support this. Hold the phone. First of all, Black Lives Matter is a very, very loose organization. And there is no way, and people who are sincere and look at this, they know that not everyone who supports or marches in a Black Lives Matter thing is a communist. Most of them are not, okay? But even still, what happens is that people react against that, as people did in the antebellum period, and they would be upset about something to do with the abolitionist argument, and they wouldn't support the abolition of slavery at all, because maybe they didn't want disunionism, or maybe they were against comadrism, or maybe they didn't like the anti-clericalism of abolitionists, or whatever. So they wouldn't participate in the movement. They wouldn't support the abolition of slavery, or whatever. And so it silenced them. And that's what happens now. People hear something, oh, that's horrible, and they try to make it so black and white. So I can't support that. We can't get involved in politics, and that's just a code word for stuff that deals with race, because Adventists love politics. Mm-hmm. If we talk about the Sunday law, talk about legislating for religious liberty, we do that all the time. That's political, okay? But whenever it comes to issues of race, we say, oh, can't get involved in politics. So if people do that, it's just a way to mask their the conservative racism. I mean, I'm not calling you a horrible person, but it's masking something that's a problem, and it's preventing people from actually making positive changes. So a mature response is not to just say, oh, Black Lives Matter is communist, let's just not do anything about it. Say, fine, if you're uncomfortable with Black Lives Matter, no one said you had to be a part of that organization or group or movement, or it's really not it's a movement. So find something else, okay? For me, I have never participated in a Black Lives March. Haven't done it. I wear a Black Lives Matter mask on campus, though. And I'm happy to support the phrase and the ideology at the basic level that Black lives do matter. And I don't see anything wrong with that. But the way I'm dealing with this issue today is primarily in these discussions. I mean, this is the way that I am doing something, but you don't have to do that. You can do a whole host of other things. We need people out there on the streets. We need people who are bringing this up for discussion in churches. We need a whole host of ways to help people understand the gospel, that we are called to take care of the oppressed. So
I have a quick question. So Adventists were engaged on behalf of Blacks in racist causes in a variety of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin, much of the work you do as a historian is looking at a comprehensive picture of what took place in the past. And when we read the Bible, a lot of it is descriptive, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's some of the actions by the patriarchs and prophets that weren't prescriptive. Some of them had multiple wives, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at our past, have you gone through a process of determining what is actually prescriptive versus maybe descriptive? And we kind of touched upon some of that with Cody's question, but
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that when it comes to these issues, that Ellen White herself especially makes it clear that it's prescriptive. In other words, she is letting Adventists know that it is your duty to be reformers. Reform was the watchword for Adventists, for Ellen White in particular. You are duty bound to be a reformer, a social reformer. That's who you are. That's part of your duty as a Christian. And I could show you numerous quotes from her about this. And so she did. She spoke out on these issues, and she was not silent, and that was important for her. And the simple fact, I think, is that she recognized the basic humanity of all people, and she recognized the only way the gospel can move forward is if you do these things. And I think she also recognized that when you do so, when you make this part of your mission to look after the physical, tangible, earthly needs of people, that opens the doors to their heart to hear the spiritual message. And so when you see her talking about evangelism, I mean, read Ministry of Healing. It's so clear in that book, for example. It's very clear that you're supposed to do both of these things, looking after the physical needs of people as well as their spiritual needs. And they go hand in hand together. And in fact, when you lead with the earthly needs of people, you open up all sorts of doors and opportunities for the gospel to reach them. Whereas if you just come in and say, let me tell you about Jesus, and you start preaching to them, etc., and you see them poor, you see them naked, Come on. I mean, let's go back to scripture. Let's look at James. Let's look at the Bible. This is not what we're supposed to do. Look after their earthly needs first, then go to the gospel. But make sure you're doing both, because you have to do both. And so I view that as a prescriptive thing. And a lot of what I've been doing in my presentation is descriptive, because I'm a historian. So that's what I focus on. I'm describing what Adventists have done. But I look at that. I look at their actions, as well as the things that they write, as being prescriptive, because they are challenging us from the grave. They're challenging us from the grave to be like they were, it of course, updated to the day that we live in. Their arguments that they use, the exact arguments that they use, wouldn't work in this day and age, because things have just changed in the world. But nevertheless, the principles that governed and guided this, the recognition of the basic humanity of all people, that Black lives do matter, even though they didn't use the phrase, of course. All of these things are really important for us as Adventists. And I will go a step further, and I think the Bible challenges us in this regard too. So as an exercise for us all, go through and look at Scripture, particularly the New Testament, and compare how many texts and passages and so forth are going to tell you to make sure that you believe correctly, right belief, good theology, versus doing correctly. I think the Bible stresses more so that we should act right, because that is a reflection of what's in our heart, which is a reflection of what we believe. And so even though we're not saved by works, sure, yes, granted, no one's going to say that we are. Works do matter. James, read James.
And I think, Joi, we have time for one final question if you want to ask one, and then we'll need to close for sake of time.
Ooh, one final. So that means it has to be a really good one. So something that I think that sometimes we think as Adventist. So, we hear, the presentation, the Abolitionist, that was the slavery, and then we talked about civil rights a little bit. Today, of course, there's justice, but, I'm nice and I like my, people who are in my life who are maybe they're Black or they're a minority. What are the implications for me today when this is not that same, or, is it really that situation of what happened, during slavery? And, I do show that I care on, one-on-one. Mm-hmm. And then speak on that as to, you said before a little bit about the gospel and how we need to care for the oppressed, but can you bring it all home as how this really relates to our gospel influence as a church and as individuals?
Yeah, I'll try. So I think a key factor that we should take away from this is that Adventists spoke out with authority during the antebellum period because we were saying stuff that wasn't popular. And I think an issue that we've had, particularly since the rise of World War I, that's the same period that we start to be called and denounced as a cult. That's a very sensitive subject for Adventists. We don't like to be called a cult. We don't like to be considered weirdos. We want to fit in. We want to be respectable. Nothing wrong with that necessarily. However, are we accommodating too much? Because it's at this exact period where we start to really embrace the other elements of conservatism in America that we hadn't embraced before. We've talked mostly about race in this presentation, but we can also talk about gender. And during this period where we start to drop the ball on racial justice, we also start to drop the ball on including women as we had before. And so historians, including myself, have pointed out in studies that we had numerous women, dozens and dozens and dozens of women in leadership positions at the time that Ellen White dies in 1915. Well, by 1940, through a variety of ways, all of those women in leadership positions lose their jobs. And this is an important thing to stress. That's not unique to Adventists. Other conservatives, the fundamentalists of the era that were really, really, really concerned about the rise of liberalism and so forth and evolution and all of those things that are, I'm a creationist. I'm happy to say that, there's nothing wrong with being, concerned about these things. But be careful who you get in bed with. And I don't mean that to sound bad, but like be careful who you get buddy with, because by beholding, we become changed. And so as we came in closer contact with fundamentalists, we began to become more like them when it came to social issues, which we had never been like them on this point. And so I think it's important for us to kind of reclaim some of those things, because we, well, I think Scripture does not support the readings that they had, to be quite honest with you, to be quite blunt with you. And there's so many ways that we can get involved in this. We can speak out in our churches, we can petition, we can do lots of other stuff. But I think what's really important is that we really reclaim it in our theology and in the way we present our message, because that's what we did when we began. We made it very clear that women had the authority to preach and speak in a time when women were not given that privilege in almost any evangelical church in the North and the South. Okay? And we defended that tooth and nail for decades and decades and decades until the early 20th century. And the same thing with Black people. We are defending their rights. I could show you and talk about Reconstruction and so forth, and how Uriah Smith is blasting from the Review because Black people are denied the right of suffrage, the right to vote. What does that have to do with Adventism? Come on, that has nothing to do with, that has everything to do with Adventism. That has everything to do with Adventism, because if we recognize the rights on this earth of the basic human rights of people, it opens the door for us to talk to them about other things. And so the message that they had, speaking out when it was unpopular, if we could somehow reclaim that, I think we would regain the power of the gospel that we once had.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for sharing and being a part of this discussion. And, it was the Apostle Paul who once stated, if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know.
Yeah.
And whether you agree or not with all that was said today, one thing I think we can all agree on is the need to be informed, to continue studying, to continue to be challenged by special revelation, the reading of Scripture and the spirit of prophecy. And in addition to that, to get better acquainted with our rich and enduring history. It was George Santayana who warned that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So to be informed on the basis of Scripture, the spirit of prophecy, and our history is of utmost importance. So may God bless you in your study as you reflect and think on these things. Happy Sabbath. All right.